Hello and welcome back to another episode of From the Field. I'm your host, Casey Orr. I'm a solution architect based in Wellington, New Zealand. Always important to specify that New Zealand part. And I believe we are multinational today because Jason, you're in Sydney?
Brisbane, yeah, not too far away.
Oh, Brisbane. Okay, so you're better than
Thanks, yeah.
or just casually throwing shade at random Australian cities that I have no interest in.
I
Um,
totally am
so
being from here.
mm, I think the other one is Melbourne, I think is the one that there's a lot of rivalry with Sydney.
Yeah, lucky I've picked Sydney and Melbourne for the demo later today, right? We can
Mm,
throw the shade then.
good,
Yeah, I
good.
think
So
Melbourne just overtook Sydney as the biggest city as well. I heard. Is that right, Jason? Do you feel
Not
much
quite,
different?
no.
No.
Look, I'll keep the brain in New Zealand. I just got back from, as you guys know, over there, and it was great spending some time with the crew. And yeah, just keen to kick off with some of the awesome stuff that we finally get to talk about, right?
nice, yeah, definitely. And I think, as many of you have seen in the title, this is part three. While it is part three, you don't actually have to have any of the context or watch the last two part videos. The first one was just fundamentals. So if you already have a good understanding of networking fundamentals in AWS, then that is fine. And then part two was around connectivity. That is around the differences of transit gateway and VPC pairing and all of that goodness. And this is really about the resilience. So it does stand alone, and we do have a demo and a lot of other exciting things. So with that, I'm actually going to go around the room. If we can go Jason, Zood, and Ruskin about, and just doing a general introduction. What's your current role? How do you currently interact with networking? And then Ruskin, if you can, from there, go into a bit of a recap.
Yeah. Thanks,
Sounds good.
Casey. Yeah, so Jason Bordajenko, look, I had it down in the blurb, but it sort of took up the rest of the screen. Just call me JB, much easier. So yeah, I'm based in Brisbane. I'm with Megaport. I think it might have been Rattan that ran the last session. I think maybe around August was the last one. Our guys in our team, I had Steve and Ryan, and they did a really bang up job, and got some awesome feedback on that. So really appreciate AWS inviting us back. So I'm with Megaport, been here about 7 years. I look after the APAC solution architecture team, and on the channel side as well, look after the global direction and the training modules and building with our team, one of the most resilient interconnectivity networks and direct connect partner. So yeah, 7 years in the game. I call cloud years like dog years. It feels a little longer, but that's the really interesting thing that I like is the state and the rate of change. So the state is never steady, and the rate of change still always seems to be increasing. So look, these sorts of things where we get to educate and talk about what it is we're doing, what's new. Customers, it's great to have that sort of turnout and see what sort of questions they're asking. But I've got some great stuff to show as well. So thanks for the invite.
Awesome, yeah, and I do remember that show because I was the host on it as well.
Ah,
Yeah, that
cool.
was a really good one. And I do 100% agree with the rate of change stuff, the generative AI especially, that
Yeah.
is exploding onto the scene. Over to you, Zoo.
Hey everyone. I'm Zu, and I work for Visa, the cloud security specialist. So I've been working with Visa for the last 7 years, and so what my current role entails me, building out a central network infrastructure and helping our teams on board onto that and start using it. And so Direct Connect plays a key part of that because we still have on-premises infrastructure that we need to integrate with, and so building this out with Megaport's help has been pretty cool. Um, yeah, it's been a great journey. I'm kind of new to cloud, like say about 3 years in, but I've been doing networking and infrastructure side for about 7 years. So um, yeah, thanks for inviting me along and having me provide some input here. It will be minimal, but yeah, it's really exciting. And
It'll be very
it's good.
insightful, though.
Yeah, yeah,
Minimal and insightful.
yeah.
Good combination. I like that.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm next. So thanks for having me on, Casey. I'm Ruskin Dandra, a solutions architect at AWS. I've been here for about 2 years, and I completely relate to the 1 year to equal to seven dog years color mentality, because with the amount of pace and change and innovation we see, not only our partners but even our customers like Zoo go through in a month, a week, sometimes even through a day. Like, things are so rapidly changing. So I come from an application development background. So I remember coding onto like C++, C Sharp, and I remember never touching networking when I was being an application developer. But then we got introduced to the cloud, and suddenly this construct like VPC came about, and we had to learn about sliders and networking and subnets. So that kind of piqued my passion a little bit. And I think one of my main callouts is that when you're looking at cloud, you're bound to touch networking, right? So that's where my passion is. I love to kind of dive into it. And I've been working on it for about a couple of years now, right? So like looking at networking on the AWS side. And just everything we do, containers, it could be microservices, it could be serverless as well. You might be running your Lambdas and VPC to understand how networking interfaces work. So that's how I interact with networking day to day. And customers like Visa Spin Clarity keep me honest, right? Because their networking is vast, complex, just so exciting. And yeah, been dealing with Megaport as well. So awesome. Thanks for having me on this as well, Casey.
No problem. Yeah, and I do really echo that whole thing because I come from the application software background as well, and just the upskilling into the cloud like side of VPC, and then even like just things around like having Lambda and VPC interactions, and then how that limits your solution just right there off the bat, like just learning those intricacies. And yeah, it's been a fun time. Very probably broke a lot more than I fixed, but that's the software developer way, right? Okay, Ruskin, do you want to give a recap of the last two sessions just quickly?
Sure, let me do that. I do have a screen share, which I'm going to pull on, but because I only have two screens, I am going to put you onto the other screen and put it on. So Casey, if you can share my screen, that'll be appreciated.
Yeah, there you go.
Awesome. So I'll just quickly go through the agenda for today as well. So obviously we're going to do a recap and a bit of Q&A, a demo, some resources, and we'll do a little bit of what's coming up next. So I have got a couple of QR codes. If you got a phone handy, have a look at it. We usually record our shows on Twitch. So the first one was around foundations, just like Casey mentioned. We looked at some basic stuff around VPCs, right? Subnets, what are CIDRs? What are availability zones? We also looked at public IPs, elastic IPs, and we touched on a couple of gateways for external connectivity, like Internet Gateway and also a NAT gateway. And we finished part one looking at security groups and VPC flow logs. So if you want to have a look at the recording for that, if you missed that session, have a look at the top QR code, scan it, it should take you directly to the recording. And the second part we touched on, now we have these VPCs, what's next? How do we connect these two things up? So we looked at connectivity between VPCs. We touched a little bit on peering, and then we looked at a construct called a transit gateway. And we slightly dove a little bit deeper into it and understood how do we kind of share transit gateway across our different AWS accounts using Resource Access Manager. Eventually, we moved on to transit gateway peering, connecting different transit gateways up to even extend the connectivity. And eventually, we ended up on private link, essentially using a network load balancer to expose some services you might be creating or consuming, similar to how like a SaaS product works. So for that one, please scan the bottom QR code and it will take you directly to the second part recording. And that brings us to part three today. So yeah, just like Casey mentioned, we're going to be looking at resilient hybrid connectivity. So which is slightly different from resilient connectivity inside your VPC, right? So there is an amazing talk we did for reInvent 2022, which is around building resilient networks within VPCs, within your AWS construct. So just want to be very clear today. So we're talking about hybrid resilient connectivity today, but there is also resiliency within AWS as well. It can't be underestimated, right? It can't be understated. There's a big piece of that around. So please have a look at that video as well. But today's talk in the next 50 minutes or 40 minutes, we'll be talking about resilient hybrid connectivity. Awesome. So back to you, Casey.
Awesome. And going to the whole concept of resiliency, it means a lot of different things based on the person you ask it to. So I guess this is where I now go around the room and go, JB, in terms of resilience, what does it mean to you from the perspective of Megaport?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we hope to see, obviously, where the customers are, and it's probably reaching out more at the edge. And look, I've said that word now. Where is the edge, right? So the Megaport definition of edge, let's start with that, is the data centers where we're present. And obviously, we work not only in the data centers where AWS are, and the Direct Connect on-ramps in particular, but we also look at other data centers further afield. And obviously, the recent release of the on-ramp in Auckland is taking that AWS edge closer. And what I want to talk about today is how do we actually get that resiliency that brings. We've got customers like Visa in New Zealand that are already using AWS connectivity from New Zealand across Megaport. And to build that in with what are the benefits now of extending and utilizing those on-ramp locations. So for me, sorry, it was the roll up to getting to the what is resiliency. I look at it in terms of you absolutely need to have that well-architected framework within the cloud and have developed for that resiliency that is the models inside cloud. But also you need to think about it in terms of obviously your own devices, the failover paths, and just ensuring that absolute uptime. People trust us quite a lot, obviously, with their network traffic. As soon as you hand it off to the Megaport network, we do a lot of the behind-the-scenes resilience work. We've got multiple paths between the data centers. There's failover links, etc. But in terms of a customer, just meet us at 2 points. They may be within the same data center, and I'll be talking about some models that can support that resilience, or it could split across two separate geographies or even two data centers within a city.
That's great. In terms of a lot of my customers, they talk about having multiple connection resiliency. Do you have any feedback or thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do. And AWS actually published some excellent guides. I think we'll get to that on the interconnect paths. So, building out resiliency, you might start with a test and a dev project, which is fine. You'll get it working with one connection and you'll say, we've outsourced our risk. We know Megaport deal with that. But if you've still got a single strand of fiber that's linking your equipment to our equipment, you still have to think about all those elements. And I generally work at sort of layer 1, 2, and 3. So one is, what is the optical light path? What is the SFPs? The little things that plug into the switches. If one of those fails, where does that traffic go? So having multiple at that location and that lower level then lets us step up to layer 2, which is the VLAN itself, right? So we have multiples of those, and then layer 3, which we'll actually show in the demo, is we can utilize and appreciate both the application and Zoo, you as well, the application backgrounds. Maybe I'm more of a network purist. I try and stay away from programming as much as possible. But I think in terms of, everything fails all the time. Was it Mr. Vogel said that? It's a great line that sticks with me. Just assume that everything will fail at those different layers and design appropriately. We absolutely do our best and maintain the uptime that we do. But in everything that we do, we say, well, what if we take out this? We almost throw those chaos monkeys at it every now and again, at least hypothetically. And we encourage customers to do so as well. So there's some cool tools that allow you to simulate failures. And if you simulate them at layer 3, they can emulate things all the way down to someone pulling a plug out.
Awesome. And Hartstead, I see that you're here. It's great to see you, and also mentioning your 56K Dart modem. That brings back a lot of memories, especially the screeching sounds. I think that I should actually get one of that as an audio file so I can actually play it whenever we're waiting for things to load.
That should be a ringtone, man. Yeah.
Oh man, you got to hear it when it's slowed right down too. It's like epic.
It's demonic. Yeah, actually, that's a really good idea, Ruskin. I actually am going to do that. And you did bring up something, and now I've derailed my whole entire train of thought. So we'll just power through that.
I'll do it again.
So from your point of view, what does resiliency mean to you as a customer?
Yeah, so at Visa, resiliency means a few different things to us, right? We build infrastructure, we bring networks, but we also build applications, right? And so at the application level, the well-architected framework, like Jason said, is something we like to adhere to, and something that we apply to what we build, and that's one level of resiliency. So it's a multi-AZ, multi-region level, but down to the networks that we have that connect into our data centers, we want that to be highly resilient as well. So, we want to weather failures in different regions without affecting our customers' ability to process transactions or process whatever transactional data that we have going through our system, right? And so definitely having that different layers of resiliency built into what we toy and what we let our application developers play with is very important to us, and it's something we try and focus on quite a bit and have multiple redundant, resilient areas built into everything.
Yes, yeah, resilience definitely is multi-layered, and you really have to take it at that because, as JB mentioned, everything fails at some point. And the comment I was going to make was especially live demos. So I'll pray for you, JB.
Thank you,
Right.
thank you.
And
I'm
for our
crossing
stuff,
everything.
right? And for our stuff, right, like a failure means quite a bit, right? Like a
Yeah.
failure in our thing
Yeah.
means someone can't process a transaction possibly at some time at a terminal or something like that. So it's something that we are very, very keen on and very aware of.
And Ruskin, from the AWS point of view, what does resiliency mean?
Yeah, I think it means the intersection of all of those things, Jason, as you mentioned, right? So especially from a customer perspective, we always have those conversations with customers. So a lot of times resiliency is looked at just a failover thing, but a lot of times we encourage customers to look at from a holistic perspective, right? So when you're resilient, what does that mean from not just your networks, from all the way from your applications? So if your applications are latency sensitive, and if you're failing over to a connection which has slightly less bandwidth or connectivity options, how does your workload react to it? So we have a lot of those conversations where it's not just the network which needs to be resilient, but how do you kind of go down, not just down the layers in the OSI layer, but also up the layers as well. Like how does your HTTP traffic react to resiliency? So I generally look at it resiliency from three main things, right? So first of all, how does your resilient network support the load? Like when you're failing over, does it cater to the load? How is it resilient to configuration errors you might make as an engineer? You might configure a route wrong, and it kind of forces all your connectivity going to the other place. It could be intentional as well. So sometimes it could be an attack vector on a particular route. It brings it down. How do you react to that, right? And finally, just like Jason said, everything fails. So when hardware fails, when you have hardware not in the data center, even at various points of your connectivity, if that fails, how are you resilient? How are you reacting to it? And finally, can't emphasize this enough, test, automation, observability. It's so critical in terms of resiliency. So it's just so layered. It's so complicated. It's not just one link. It's not just networks. It's not just layer 3. It's layer 2, 1, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right. Yeah.
And to your point, like we've already discussed like 3 different definitions of resiliency, what it means to each individual person, and every business is built up of multiple stakeholders. So how do you really go around and build up that consensus, get all of those stakeholders on board and, provide that time and funding needed to really sit down and make sure you have something that is resilient and will stand the test of time?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a conversation we are not perfect at, right? We're never perfect at that conversation, because every time we talk about resiliency, we start off as saying, yep, we want everything resilient. We want 10 gig connections going 4 ways, and then we're like, okay, this will cost you X, Y, Z. Then they're like, okay, we need to tone it down a little bit. And then we start talking about, cool, what is your SLA? What are you expecting, right? So I remember having a conversation with Sue over a year ago about exactly that, and I'll probably pass it on to Sue as well to talk about his experience on how did he kind of balance that out as well. But it's always about cost. What's your SLA? What are your expectations?
Yeah.
What are your end customers looking at, right? So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, definitely, Ruskin. Like I remember that conversation, and it's definitely multiple stakeholders and multiple ways you need to convince people that this is what we need, but this is the cost trade-off, and this is the SLA trade-off that we need to factor in to get it all going, right? Like and at the Visa level, there's definitely a lot of red tape that you need to jump through, a lot of people you need to talk to, and a lot of groups you need to convince. So it's people within your business group and outside of your business group as well, and convincing them may mean building infrastructure and dev and test that has a certain kind of resiliency that they see, and prove it to them, right? And factor in the cost as well, and show the numbers and forecast that out to the future as well, because that's something we're always keenly looking at is growth as well, right? We want to grow our systems, we want to make it bigger and better, and so if we build something now at a certain cost rate, how will that look in the future as well? That's something we definitely need to forecast and get people's approval on and get stakeholder buy-in for as well, right? Cost is a big factor for sure.
I actually wonder if it's a law of diminishing returns, right? At some point you hit that add a few more extra zeros, but you still can't take that possibility of failure somewhere along the line completely away. You can reduce it a hell of a lot, but it's that at what point do I go, this is enough nines? And this for every conversation with every customer, it is, yes, we understand your workloads are now critical. It's not just we're having a play and seeing how it goes. We absolutely need to step that game up, but at the same time, we want to give those options without breaking people's brains. The combinations that they can get into, they're pretty diverse now. So I think about it to simplify it to a straight line. It's got 2 points. It's got where I am, where I want to go. There are some dots that I can put in the middle. I can slightly bend that line through another point, and it can introduce risk, or it can be used to take risk away.
And someone has mentioned the concept of zero trust infrastructure, which apparently the resilience we're talking about is very similar to it. And it's same thing. Lots of people have different definitions of it. And sorry, Ruskin, what you were saying?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing, and I think Jason kind of just jogged my memory there. A lot of customers and a lot of partners we see try and boil the ocean when it comes to resiliency, right? So, and sometimes they boil the ocean on one side of the connectivity, right? So they might be looking at, awesome, I want to do everything multi-AZ, which is great, highly recommended, and they miss a critical part. Like, say they might be using VPNs coming into through the internet. And they completely boil the ocean on the AWS side, make everything resilient, which we do make it easier for them, which is great. But then the critical part is the VPN connectivity, so they kind of miss that sometimes, right? So if you're looking at it, I highly recommend looking at holistic, right? So just like Zoo said as well, look at the business value you're providing. Look at the workload you're providing resiliency for, and a lot of times your connectivity supports multiple workloads, right? It's not that you will have one direct connect just for one workload, you'll have another direct connect for another workload. So your direct connect, your VPN supports multiple workloads. So which one is the most critical? Do you want to afford for that? Do you want to cater for that? It's very hard, right? And as teams get bigger, as customers get bigger, as we get geographically dispersed in development teams and things like that, it becomes harder and harder. So that's why resiliency is not just a point in time thing you do. It's you have to constantly evolve it as well as your workloads change in nature, as you get more customers on board it. So super critical to kind of, it's a journey, and you keep building on it.
How do you, this is quite an interesting question from Hardsoap. How do you handle cases where stakeholders take a failure will never happen to us viewpoint to minimize spend on resiliency features they deem unnecessary? That's a great question. Like, it's definitely something we run into a lot, and I think all of us, even Zoo internally, it'd probably have to have this discussion to some level.
Right, yeah, for sure. I guess you have to counter that with a question of, nothing will never happen, but if something does happen, what will be the cost of it? That is the real conversation you need to have. Like, sure, it may never ever happen, but if something does happen, what is the cost, and what will that mean to the business? And I think that will start getting the true answers out of stakeholders that have that kind of viewpoint, right? Because yeah, sure, our systems are great, they're 100% uptime, right? Sure. 100% uptime, but like, if something does ever happen, what is the impact going to be to your brand and to your customers, and factor that into the conversation, because you really just can't stop anything from ever happening, right? Like Jason was saying, like, there's your little fiber could fail, right? Anything could fail at any layer, and like, when that happens, what will be the cost to your system? And that usually really gets people thinking about it, and who will you have to answer to, and who will you have to then write reports to?
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples for this is when I say, well, like, a whole neighborhood lost connection to the internet because during one of our local elections, a politician went out and hammered a sign into the ground. And that just so happened to be a 1 in a million chance that went straight through the middle of a fiber optic cable.
What are the odds?
So, yeah, like, and you would say that would never happen, and I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure it would probably won't happen again in many, many years, but it happened.
Well, it's an
and you have to
interesting
argue.
thing to say, what's the worst that could happen? And, if you deal with anyone that's, I don't know, servicing a hospital or an emergency services, like, well, people die, right? And it's pretty extreme, and it opens your eyes. I've had the privilege of working with a few, and I go, okay, I probably shouldn't have asked that question. I know that's not everyone, but what that does is it opens your eyes to those potential failures. But not only that, first order of failure, but what happens to you, right? Yeah, you get a few reports to write, but then what happens to your customers? So if you think about, okay, payment processing here, if they're standing and trying to make a purchase, it may actually be more critical than you're giving it credence for. I'm sure Visa aren't in this position, but we actually need to think a few orders beyond just, what's immediately in front of us to actually evaluate that.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit more to that as well. It's risk-based, right? So if you're talking to someone and say, oh, that will never happen, right? Have a think about something which will happen and someone who cares, right? So yes, your end customer might get impacted. You need to quantify that a little bit as well and have that conversation with the right stakeholder. Dev might think that will never happen. I'm happy with that. Maybe the leads might not care as well. Someone will care, right? It might be an exec, or it could be a board member, or it could be someone who's spending hours or days analyzing this risk. And there is a small probability of happening, but the impact is huge, right? It brings us to that whole risk matrix. I don't want to get all corporate-y right now, but you do kind of imagine the likelihood, the frequency of it happens, and you kind of multiply that to give you the impact of it, right? So if everything is within your RTO and RPO, and if you can just set up another VPN, your automation is top-notch, sure, and downtime wouldn't cost you much. But if your patients' lives are at risk, then it's a big impact, right? So it's all about understanding the risk, understanding what stakeholders care about it, pulling at that string, right? And having the conversation is at the right level. But nothing will ever go wrong is a fallacy in its own kind of sense. There's always a probability. There's never zero probability.
And on that front, do we have any like toolkits or models that we can simplify this whole endeavor?
Yeah, so AWS provides obviously the resiliency toolkit, right? So it is quite simple if it starts off. Obviously, we have a maximum resiliency, we have a high resiliency, and we have a dev test workload option as well. But as you start diving deeper into it, right? As you start looking at locations, as you start looking at your workloads, as you start looking at regions, it sort of gets a little bit more complicated. So as always, on the surface, cool. You need a multi-site redundant connection to be your highest resiliency. Next one down, you need multi-site non-redundant connections to be high. And then eventually you just need a single site connectivity for your dev test workload. So in practice, it all sounds quite easy, but we'll in the next half an hour, we'll pass it on to Jason to kind of show you how this is set up, right? And I completely appreciate that you might not be doing this often, or you might not be the one doing it, but understanding how it kind of fits in together, it's very beneficial, right? And what we'll do next is essentially go through these demos, right? And what I can do is there time for the demo now, Casey? I guess that's the first question. If it is, what I'll do is I'll show a quick diagram of what we're going to demo, just to kind of bring everyone on the same page, right? I'm very visual, maybe some other people are as well. I'll just show you what we're going to set up, and then Jason will power through it, and then we'll ask some really, really hairy questions from Jason and see how it goes. So give me 1 second while I share my screen.
I've said my demo prayers, and you're going to ask some hairy questions as well. That's good. Put me on the spot.
All right. So if you can, Casey, just share my screen for me.
There we go.
Oh. So yeah, we talked about resiliency toolkit, right? So there's a QR code up there. So definitely have a scan through that. You can simply just search for it, right? There's a lot of collateral on resiliency. There's a toolkit available. There's a whole framework around it, and just kind of quickly run through it. So we obviously have high resiliency, where you have multi-site, non-redundant connectivity. So you have a direct connect location on the top, you have a direct connect location on the bottom, you're coming into a AWS region. So note that there is no redundant routers or no redundant connections into your direct connect locations. And as you move to a slightly maximum resiliency, you're having that option of that redundancy at that site as well. And so we'll go through a little bit of this, right? So then let me go on to the next slide. So Jason, why don't I pass it on to you to show us what you're going to be demonstrating? I think you're going to be looking at two main aspects to it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be showing us?
Yeah, for sure. So the slide that you have, and thank you, Ruskin, for throwing the diagrams as I've been working on the demo. The slide you've got there is really looking at, I guess, what we wanted to talk about, primarily around the New Zealand audience that we have online, that the new on-ramp location in Auckland, we've now got Megaport enabled, and what that means. I think in the maximum resiliency slide you showed 2 physical data centers, and everyone that should have 2 data centers at their disposal, right? It doesn't always happen. So as we've seen with path optimization, etc., some people are moving VPNs. Well, they're good enough until they're not, but generally our customers and where we hit the edge and that definition I was talking about, we've at least got one physical location where we can either get connectivity to that is Megaport enabled, or where we actually have equipment resident. So this diagram that you have here is actually picking on a site in Wellington that I'll use for the demo. It's creating 2 Megaports. You see that little red dot and little blue dot. So on the AWS side, there's this concept of the diversity zones, availability zones, and on our side, we have diversity zones. We will name them red and blue for want of a better term. That is also matched at the location in Auckland where we meet the AWS network. So we can create that. It looks like a single path through and that connection between those sites, but it actually traverses multiple fiber paths. So if a politician puts, the stake in the ground, I like that example now, and takes out one of those paths, our routes between those data centers are actually protected by default. What is not protected, obviously, as I mentioned, was, failure on the customer router. Well, yeah, we've covered that. We've got 2 routers, maybe 2 locations, or any of those cross connects. That, as I said, is just a fiber. What if someone closes a rack door on it or something like that? So the resilience that we build, and what I'll concentrate is on the customer side, but there is an assumption that that's been built in the cloud side and obviously to that direct connect as well.
Awesome. And just to add a little bit to it, as it stands right now, it's high resiliency. If you want to move it more to a maximum resiliency, just to what Jason was saying, you need that multi-site redundant, right? So you just need another location, another DX port, and you need 4 routers. So essentially you are connecting. You have redundancy, not only at on-site, but also at a different site as well. So that's essentially making it from high to maximum, if I remember my terminology correctly.
Yeah, we can spread that across the Sydney handoff, the Sydney on-ramp, and the Auckland one now.
Perfect. And I think that's the next one where you have a demo. I love this part of the demo where you're actually showing a live ping test, right? So tell us a little bit more about that, Jason, what you're going to be demonstrating there.
Yeah, look, this one, I've got a very deliberately long path. On the left-hand side, you'll actually see our workload is in Tokyo. So I don't know on the Visa side where your workloads are, but I'm sure as a global network, this is probably more realistic. It'll be a very long ping time. It's quite deliberate. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm now introducing from our customer site. So I'm flipping, if we think of Tokyo and we think of Wellington in that previous scenario as an L, we're flipping the leg of that L over to the other side of Australia. So our customer site on the right-hand side here is actually on, as I'm looking at the map, on the left-hand side. So it's in Perth. And then that connectivity is going via the East Coast through both Sydney and Melbourne. So we're actually using AP Southeast 2, so Sydney, and AP Southeast 4, which is the new Melbourne region. And I'm introducing another concept that might be new to some of you, which is MCR, that's Megaport Cloud Router. So if you think about some of the concepts that we spoke about in previous scenarios where the AWS gateways are available, it's an optional element that Megaport provide. It's a routing element, so that layer 3 resilience. And I'll actually switch off one of those direct connects live and see that we're still passing the traffic through to our workload.
Awesome. Nice. And one final thing, and then I can just pass it on to Jason so I don't have to keep swapping screens, going towards what it looks like for the Auckland DX port, right? So I think Jason kind of alluded to the fact that everything what we talked about can be applied to Auckland. But if you're kind of a visual person and if you want to have a look at what it looks like, this is essentially it, right? So Megaport have a few, what is it, up to 15 locations in New Zealand where they provide facilities. and you can just connect one to Auckland, one to Sydney to give you that that resiliency you require, and away you go to your workload on the left-hand side. Anything more on this, Jason, before I hand it over to you for the demo?
No, that's awesome. I think you've done a great job in representing it, and I'll step through it and happy to take questions as we go. There's a few parts to it, so I'll sort of do it somewhat deliberately, but I will start with the end in mind, which is we're really looking at it. Yes, obviously the introduction of the on-ramp in Auckland as a direct connect enabled location is great. Double time if you're in that data center. If you're not, if you're in any other data center, and this applies obviously across our geography, but speaking in New Zealand, so that's Auckland, Hamilton, and Wellington. I'll build it from the Wellington scenario for this example, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks for that. So Casey, if you can hand over the screen sharing to Jason, we'll go from there.
And there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I'm going to take through a few different pieces. I'll just make sure all the puzzle pieces are fitting well together. So this is me logged in live to Direct Connect console. I'll just check that, yeah, okay, we're able to navigate. This is my connectivity through Melbourne. Let me step back one. I mentioned the locations. So if we just take us to the Megaport website. So we're talking about the resilience and high availability parts of Direct Connect and the toolkits that are available. Megaport website, not just our portal, and it's very similar obviously to how AWS have structured their portal. The documentation that we have available, not just sales collateral, but obviously down to building resilient connections. Everything that I'm going to be talking about is documented here. So if you do navigate over to the website or just search on Megaport enabled locations, you'll actually land on this page. The reason I like diving into this is it's sort of a visual representation of where those, where the gravity of those data centers are. So if I was to look into Auckland, we can see that it's fairly well distributed, and then we can move down to Hamilton. And if I go further afield, down into Wellington as well. We're not in the South Island, yet. Happy to take queries for those that want us to be there, but we'd love to have that interest. I'll be building to one of the Wellington locations today. This site isn't just pretty graphics. However, if you know something about your data center, as I said, like let's say Wellington, I can do a search on that and it will pull up those enabled locations. And we're actually going to be picking on this one here. So Datacom, Able Smith Street. And we'll be making a connection back towards AWS. And you can see our other sites that are matching that filter. This is important when I take it across to the Megaport
Jason,
portal.
just one more thing on that on that tab. I love the fact that it actually shows you what ports are available and where the MCRs are available as well. So if you can demo that as well, I think that's very handy because a lot of customers ask us, or can you tell us what's enabled at this location from an AWS perspective, and how does it go end to end? So a lot of partners, Megaport included, they have these really cool enabled maps, locations, which help you understand what capabilities are available and what you can leverage, right? So if you're looking at an MCR, or if you're looking at a 100G link in a particular location, you can actually dive a little bit deeper into these functionalities, and it will tell you what's available at that, and even sometimes latency as well as Jason has shown, which is really cool.
Fantastic. We can obviously dive into the latency statistics from the viewpoint of that particular DC as well. So that's a great resource to have. No, thank you for pointing that out, Ruskin. Some of the really interesting stuff in terms of the diversity, and where I mentioned, we've got those diversity zones is available in the actual portal itself, so portal.megaport.com. Everything I've shown you up until this point, you don't need a login, you don't need authentication. It is possible to sign up from there into the portal, and this gets you into the operational piece. So much like the AWS portal itself, you do need to provide your credentials and create an account to do what I'm doing now. In the interest of time, and it sounds like I'm selling steak knives, here's one I prepared earlier. I've created a port at this site that I was talking about, so the one in Wellington, the Datacom site. It's a 10 gigabit per second capable port. I'm not using all 10 gigs of it just in this case. I'll step back to the ordering process. And straight away, after I've created that port, I'm presented a list of targets. And we're going to be talking about AWS, talking about the connectivity that I can build through now the enabled Auckland on-ramp. And I can actually see from just clicking on AWS and hosted connection, I'll just filter that down to New Zealand. And we can see as a target now, so my B end, where I want to head, I can actually send that connection off to, and it's again replicated by those zones, the red and the blue. So we effectively, I've only built one port on the customer side, but we can already send 2 connections towards that on-ramp location in Auckland. What a lot of
Jason,
customers...
when you're talking about on-ramps, you're talking about these DX POP locations, right? So there's a slight terminology differences, just to be clear here.
Yeah.
So we have them on our site as DX POP locations. If you go into like the AWS documentation, I think we're just calling them on-ramps here from the Megaport perspective.
Yeah, that's right. So that's where we meet the Direct Connect POP, absolutely. Now, in terms of ordering a port, if this is something a customer has not done, or in fact they may already have a port but they don't have diversity, this isn't reflected on the locations page, but it is possible to see. Again, I'll filter down to New Zealand, so those sites now are represented by the data center operator. And the one that I was looking at obviously before was this site in Wellington. What if a customer was building to that maximum resilience model and they had another site? They had one in that Datacom site and one in Rivera, for example, in Wellington. It is possible to do diversity at the data center level. That would just be me stepping ahead and ordering that. But if I don't have that privilege, if I'm only located in that one site, we can actually then come into ordering a new port. And I'm presented an option here which says, for port diversity, do I want to make this is from the outset, a set of ports that are diverse from each other, and that will actually populate them, one in red, one in blue, or do I actually want to upgrade effectively? Do I want to use that and create one that's diverse from existing port? And I can see that I've already deployed one into blue, so JB AWS NZ1, and it will just ask me for a name, so I'll probably mirror that, NZ2. My typing.
So can you pair these? Can you pair these after the fact? Is that what you're saying, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you already are driving traffic across one of those links, if that site has that diversity, you can just say order a new port, click on diverse from existing port, and it will find any ports that are at that site. And then it will say, but I actually have another set of infrastructure and I can deploy against that. So I don't need to rebuild everything from scratch. I can go in and say, okay, this is NZ1. I want to make a new one. Make NZ2 as diverse from that. And you can see that's going to pick the... Yeah, go for it.
We have a quick question while you go through the ordering process of what is the relationship between an AWS Direct Connect location and the Megaport data centers?
Yeah, good question. So if I go back to the enabled locations page, we're in many data centers that are not actually AWS Direct Connect enabled data centers. So in the case of New Zealand, as I was saying, if we actually zoom right out, if we look at New Zealand as a whole, Megaport are actually enabled, and all of the functionality that I was just showing is in 16 data centers, all on the North Island, but across those 3 metros. So at the moment where AWS are located and where that Direct Connect POP is one of those 16. So I say the AWS side is one of those facilities, but we can actually order Direct Connect services in another 15. And it is on demand. This is not someone running around and finding a patch cable and plugging it in and hoping for the best. This is in the next 2 to 3 minutes. If you have a port that's connected with us, and that's the process I was just stepping through, you'll be able to order a Direct Connect in about 1 or 2 minutes. All right. Did I answer the question? Thumbs up. Cool. So what I've done there is that's my new port that I've configured, AWS NZ2. And I'll actually step through that process. So if I go back now to, I'm going to use hosted connection, and I'm going to pick the New Zealand site. So my port here is actually in the red zone. It's irrelevant for diversity. Sorry, it is a relevance that is only in diversity zones for a single data center. So I don't necessarily need to match red to red and blue, blue to blue, for example. I generally recommend that as a point of interest for customers. Just making sure that they think in terms of diversity. Where am I? I'm in Wellington. I've picked this particular port in one diversity zone. And where am I going to? And that's the AWS location in Auckland in this case. So in terms of what questions we ask, we only need to fill out the fields with the red stars. So this is my AWS hosted connection. So this is just a VLAN that I'm building. And we notice that we actually support all of those speeds from 50 megabits per second all the way up to 10 gigabits per second. And we'll return a price based on that particular size, right? So in that case, we're coming up with a monthly rate for that. If I want to assign a VLAN tag at that point, I can actually let the system assign it. I might just say, give me VLAN 1000. We'll go off and do a check. And that's facing the customer. That's actually not looking on the AWS side. We'll negotiate all of that automatically. And now I just need to get challenged, what's my account ID? And really, that's all we need to do. This request, as soon as I put it in, as I said, I haven't plugged in the site in Wellington in this case, but it will go through into AWS. And I'll actually show that coming up on the AWS console as well. All right, so we've placed that order. And we can see that's currently sitting in a design stage. It's deploying as we speak. So the API magic is weaving its way in. And in a minute or two time, we should actually see that populate on this part. So the Direct Connect Connections tab. As I said, I've just got that one at the moment that I showed at the start. I'll pause there for questions, and we can keep rocking along.
Quick question from me, Jason. So as a customer, if I wanted maximum resiliency or high resiliency, and if I don't want to go through this entire process, right? Do you have hopes in the future where you just say, I want to connect this site to this site with maximum resiliency, do all the red, blue stuff for me with this site? Can you give us a peek into if that is possible? Because it is good. Like, I'm coming from application background. I don't have networking expertise. I just want to get my data center connected to AWS using maximum resiliency and fill in the blanks.
Yeah. Right now, I'm going to say the portal doesn't drive that. I don't see us going to that level of integration, but I will say that we do support, and this is probably more to the CLI answer, so hopefully appealing to the developer in you. We do have a Terraform provider available, and so I think the extension of what we do, and obviously it's great to say we've got an API that supports that, is create a Terraform process that can actually be worked through to say, yes, I want to deploy maximum resiliency. Ask a couple of questions. So where am I? Do I have physical ports, and start enabling them? And yes, it could absolutely build that. There are a few steps and questions that need to be asked, but we, as the team of solution architects here and our partners and their solution architects, alongside yourselves and the teams, absolutely work to specify this to suit the customer requirements. And you can see as I've been rabbiting away there, Ruskin, that connection's actually come up now for me. So I can see that inbound request is sitting in Datacom. Again, I was in Wellington. This is the one in Auckland that it's saying, and that's that 50 meg request. And I can just go, yep, that was me. Let's make it happen. So realistically, I could be passing traffic in the next couple of minutes. All right. So if there's not too many further questions, I might leave that one and we'll start talking about the example where we were building not just a direct connect into Auckland, but we were also talking about what we currently had and where that hands off to Sydney. So right now I'm using the Megaport network between Wellington, and I'm actually taking that up to Auckland. It is possible to also use the Megaport network across to Sydney. At the moment, I'm handing it to AWS in Auckland, and it's using the AWS network back. So we've got multiple paths and fiber paths, both across the Trans-Tasman element and within the North Island itself. So hopefully avoids that shaky isle phenomenon sometimes. What I really wanted to get into, though, if you don't mind me stepping ahead, is to do a quick failover. So again, in the interest of here's one I've done earlier, I'm going to come back to our portal, and I'll just filter that for New Zealand. All right, so we can see those two ports that I built, and that connection that I showed on the AWS console is now live. Let's go to broader search. And I've actually deployed now, and this is the second button. So you see that top left button that says Create Port? I've gone into previously and created this MCR, so Megaport Cloud Router. The reason I'm using this is it's an interesting quirk with hosted connections that we got a lot of questions across the Trans-Tasman elements that once I've deployed that, let's say it's a 50 megabit per second hosted connection, what if I need to burst that up? What if I need that to be 100 megs or I need that to be a gig? And with hosted connection, it is possible to go through that process as I showed in almost real time and deploy a new one, right? I can order that essentially net new. The thing with MCR is I can use a Trans-Tasman element on the Megaport network that is actually fully variable. So I can burst that up or down at any time. And the MCR is a routing engine. So then I can land on the MCR and make a high bandwidth connection, maybe 1 gigabit per second. I can do that towards AWS, but I won't incur the fee that I would see on that Trans-Tasman element. The thing with an MCR is they are itself in terms of speeds. We have 4 different options. They're shown there. So 1, 2.5, 5, and 10 gigabits per second. And the pricing is based on that. So it's sort of your high watermark. If I was to pick a routing element that's at 1 gigabit per second, I could do my Trans-Tasman link at 10 megabits per second. Traffic's there, it will pass, but it's not my high watermark. I'm using Auckland for that case. But on the Sydney side, where I'm actually landing this into AWS, I could have a higher bandwidth element. And that's what I want to demonstrate with this one that I've built. And it only, again, takes a couple of minutes, so it's not a lengthy process. But this one that I've built, you can see here, I'm utilizing a 20 megabit per second service that's in Perth. You can see that at the bottom there. And that is totally variable. As I said, I could make that change in a matter of minutes to burst that up or down. And then I've got a connection from the MCR itself into Sydney, and another that's going into Melbourne. So this is going into AP Southeast 4. It could actually be 2 different data centers in Sydney. I'm just using different regions in this case as well. And what I wanted to show you first is the reason I've actually picked MCR for this is I have this great little resource called a Looking Glass. And for those of you that are probably more familiar on the networking side, it's just visibility for those routes, right? So I can see on the left-hand side, here's my connection to Sydney, here's my connection to Melbourne, and this is the one that's going back to my on-prem device in Perth. Now, what's interesting is I have a host. Let me click the right button and we'll get that host. This host is actually in Tokyo, and I've deliberately passed the traffic on a really long path. And you can see that it'll come back about 466 or 467 milliseconds. It's great. It's actually going through the MCR. It's using Direct Connect on the East Coast, and it's hitting my workload that sits up in Japan. If I come back to this scenario here, we can see that route for that host is going to be one of these two. Sorry, one of the two below. Here we go, 172.31. So that is actually talking about the CIDR subnets. That's where we're sitting in terms of the target, the location that's in Japan, the workload itself. And what's interesting for me is that if you see that best route, there's a cross and there's a tick. So currently we're actually driving that traffic through the route that's got the tick. What if I was to take that route away? Right? So we should hopefully see this ping that's happily sitting at 466, 467. We're going to take that route away. We're going to remove it from it entirely. So I can do that. I'll come back to the AWS console and I'll pick on the one that I had in Melbourne. Down at the VIF level, so in the individual VIF that I've created, I can see those peerings. I can see that this is using a particular router, so 96, which actually matches up with the one that was showing the tick on it. And I'm going to take it away. So under the actions, I'll say bring down BGP, just take it away for a minute. Give the yep, I want to enhance the chaos on this route. Cool, that's going to go and take that route away from me. So in a couple of seconds, we should actually see that path change. So the outcome there, and the reason I've deliberately given it quite a long path, and we can see that's changed now to 444, right? 443, 444, is it's now transiting via Sydney by me taking that route away. What I really wanted to show is that there wasn't a gap. So that traffic is flowing in real time through the MCR in this case, or it could be at a customer level, across multiple devices. It allows customers to build, and it was that sort of concept of, yeah, I've got a straight line. Where am I? Where do I want to go? But now I'm actually taking it through a routing element that can make those decisions for me. And that's how I can build out more resilient models, again, that even utilize things like different regions in this case. I think the prayers might have worked, just saying.
I was crossing my fingers the whole time.
Yeah, I just come back to this page again. So that was the one before I loaded, and you notice that it had the tick and the cross, and I'll just hit reload. We should now see that flicked across. You've seen the outcome of it, but prove it out. We'll come back and make sure that that's happy. All right, so I can see that Melbourne is down. We've actually lost that route entirely, so there's nothing with a cross in it, but the Sydney route is up and passing that traffic quite happily. So this is what we're encouraging customers to build, get these concepts in, utilize as many of those on-ramps as possible, and utilize things like the MCR that can actually make that connectivity real-time and uninterruptible. You've got to get that out. Pause there. I've been talking a lot without many questions, but hopefully there's been some questions in the chat as well.
No, I think that's exactly right? So the resiliency, it's not just the latency changing as well, but just the uninterruptible the fact that it was uninterruptible, you didn't see a ping fault. I mean, yes, you can build your applications to retry and things like that, but it's really important to reduce that amount of failover time. Yes, a lot of capabilities in modern routers, links, and things like that to cater for failures and make it as seamless, as quick as possible. So, highly recommending having a chat with either Megaport, myself, or even customers like Zoo and Visa who've done it in the past and learning from them, right? So awesome demo, appreciated, Jason. So
Yeah,
really
thanks,
cool
Ruskin.
stuff there. Great stuff. Pass it back over to you, Casey.
Nice, and I do have to say I appreciate yourself, Jason and Zoo, coming on to show and sharing your expertise. I'll do a little bit more to that, but I just want to say that we do have a LinkedIn community called the AWS New Zealand Technical Community. So if you are interested in reaching out or just want to be part of an awesome community, New Zealand is always in need of IT as well, and we're a great country. Just hinting there. If you actually do want to, move to the wonderful green and lovely country that is New Zealand. Enough plugs for that. Next week, we do have a session coming up, which is around solving the hardest problem of making modern distributed applications more observable. So that is a break from our networking talks. And then the week after that, we have a great talk around what is part 4 of the series, part 4 of 5, I should say, which is going to be diving into performance best practices. So how can you get the most out of these networks? And yeah, thank you, Ruskin, for coming on. It's great having specialists like you within AWS to actually come onto From the Field and share knowledge. Jason, as always, love working with you guys. And again, thank you for being so knowledgeable and sharing it. And Zoo, as always, I love it when customers come on and share with the wider world the good stuff you're doing.
Of course. Thank you.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, Casey.
No problem. And on that night, I will say Matiwa and enjoy your weekend. And I think it's Anzac Day on Tuesday next week.
Tuesday, yeah.
So if you're Australian and New Zealand, enjoy that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Casey. Appreciate it. Thanks all.
Cheers, folks. Bye, everyone.